What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to today's video. I know it's been a minute since I last posted a video here on the channel, but we are back. And in today's video, we dive into some more budget decks with the release of Midnight Haunt, the new set from Magic the Gathering in MTG Arena. These budget decks are consistent of probably about like 4-ish rares per deck at most, just to kind of get you started. I kind of played around some of the new archetypes of things that got introduced with the release of Midnight Haunt. So some of these decks may be something you may have seen me do kind of prior, but with the release of newer cards to these particular like tribes or whatnot, these decks have kind of gotten a little bit of a boost. But with that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely lets me know you guys like these videos. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. It lets you know that I post a new video, and it helps out the channel by putting a +1/+1 counter on it. And with that being said, let's just dive into it and let's just talk about the decks. So the first deck up is a Gruel Wolves or Gruel Werewolves, whatever you want to call it. I called it Wolves just because, but essentially Werewolves and Wolves are kind of got an influx of cards with the release of Innistrad with the new Nightbound and Daybound mechanic. The deck here is playing around a lot of that. I know there's probably other Wolves I probably could have included in this deck, but I decided to kind of more so focus on the newer cards, and you guys can experiment and add in some of the older cards that we already have in these kind of creature creature types if you want to add some of like the older cards that you may already have in your collection. But this is kind of like a list to get you started. We are also playing Snow because I do think Snow has some of the better synergies with fight spells and things like that and removal. Just because green, other than fight spells, lacks really any sort of like spot removal and things like that. So we added the red because that helps as well. We added also the red because of Tovolar, the new guy from Innistrad Midnight Haunt. Whenever werewolf we control deals combat damage to a player, we draw a card, so it gives us a little bit more tempo because these colors typically don't really have a lot of ways to get tempo. And at the end of our upkeep, if we control 3 or more wolves or werewolves, it becomes night and then transform any number of human werewolves you control, and it essentially plays into that Nightbound Daybound mechanic. On the other side, we have Tolvar, the Midnight Scourge. Whenever a wolf or werewolf controls deals combat damage, we still continue to draw a card. But then we gain this ability that we can tap X plus a red and a green. Target wolf or werewolf we control gets +X+0 and gains trample then in turn. And essentially, it's like a way to kind of like get over the top, maybe to finish off our opponent with that additional ability. We dump some mana into it. Having mana sinks in a deck, in a mechanic where, casting spells, slows us down from getting into that Nightbound side. So having things to dump our mana into that don't count as spells is always very good as well. Other than that, I mean, the deck is pretty cool. We have Frostbite's 4 copies of it because we are playing Snow Mana. It becomes a very good spot removal spell. We only have Snow Permanents, our Snow lands, so it should eventually get to the 3 the 3 or more Snow Permanents to give it the additional 1 point of damage. We are experimenting with Play with Fire. I'm not really 100% sure on this, but it is a shock essentially. But if we deal damage to our opponent's face, we also get the Scry on top of it, or 2 damage to any target if we need that spot removal. Of course, because we are playing green, Blizzard Brawl and Snow go hand in hand, giving us the ability to give our creature +1/+0, indestructible, and then able to fight a target creature. Opponent controls to kind of remove them that way. We also have Snakeskin Veil because in case we want to protect any of our wolves or werewolves that are transformed that are kind of necessary for us to get through. So always going to have a little bit of a +1/+1 and a little bit of hexproof for 1 mana. In the true drop slot, we have Duel for Dominance. It's a card I'm kind of messing around with. Yet again, it's another fight spell. But this one has this Coven ability, which is an ability that if you control 3 or more creatures with different power and toughness, something happens. So you choose target creature you control, target creature you don't control. If you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on that creature, and then that creature fights another creature. So it's a little bit slightly more expensive of a Blizzard Brawl, but something I'm kind of messing around with. I'm not really sure if I'm sold with it just because the creature's power and toughness are kind of all over the place. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. The Coven ability, so that is kind of one of those things that we could always cut these out if we feel like we're going too heavy into the fight spells. But because I am trying to limit the rares, I just figured I needed like another one because I know there's that other rare one from Zendikar Rising with the kicker, and then you get a whole bunch of other things on top of the fight spell. We have Outland Liberator, 2 mana, 2/2, with the ability to sacrifice it, destroy target artifact or enchantment. And on the reverse side, it also has destroy target artifact or enchantment for 1 mana to sacrifice it. But the other ability that we gain when it becomes a werewolf is that whenever it attacks, we have to destroy target artifact or enchantment defended player controls. So that's like the one benefit. It gains like the mechanic that Kogla had, where when Kogla attacks, it destroys target artifact or enchantment. So that's pretty cool. Kestig Naturalist is actually a really strong card in this deck. For being an uncommon 2 mana 2/2, whenever it attacks, we get to ramp up a mana of a red or a green. And that's pretty decent for the one side. And if we are able to flip it over, it becomes essentially our Lord of the Werewolves, as it gives other wolves and werewolves we control +1/+1. And then whenever it attacks, it also creates a red or a green. So it's definitely a benefit to have this card in the deck, just because it is a way to ramp us up, play some of our more expensive spells earlier, as well as eventually if we become a werewolf, it then becomes our werewolf lord to pump up our other werewolves. Then we have Pax Betrayal. It's an interesting card yet again. It can control target creature and end of turn. Untap that creature, it gains haste and end of turn. If we control werewolf, we get the scry too. So that's kind of one of those things we're kind of playing into. Might as well play this card, kind of see how it works. We don't really have any ways to sacrifice the creature that our opponent we may steal from our opponent. But taking an opponent's creature and then maybe swinging in at our opponent is definitely very good. And again, the ability to scry and fix the top cards of our library is also good. Then we have Hound Tamer. It's a 3 mana 3/3 with trample, and and for 4 mana we can dump and put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. And then when it flips over on the Untamed Pup, other wolves and werewolves control gain trample. So giving all our werewolves trample is definitely pretty awesome. And then also still continues to have the ability to give a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and then becomes also a 4/4. Then we have Howl the Haunt. It's a 3 mana enchantment aura. Enchant creature when it enters the battlefield. If enchanted creature is a wolf or a werewolf, untap that creature. And enchanted creature has +2/+2 and vigilance. Yet again, it's something I'm doing a 2 of. It'd be nice to give one of our wolves or werewolves vigilance, which makes it pretty awesome to attack it with something and leave it back on defense, which is pretty awesome. And most of the wolves that we have in the deck, or werewolves in the deck, will become at least a 4/4 or greater. So that's definitely a pretty decent blocker to be on the back end. The one downfall I think to this deck, just looking at it, is that we don't really have a lot of ways to protect the air other than fighting things in the air. So that's kind of one of those things that I do think is kind of lacking. There's not many werewolves or wolves with reach. And then we have Tovolar. I kind of already went over it, but it's definitely like the rare that I kind of want to go with. I did 2 copies of it just because it's legendary. I think at most you don't want to play more than 3 because you can only play 1 on the battlefield at any given time. So 2 copies I actually think is pretty good to start off, and then you can always try to get yourself a third one. Then for the mana base, we did 9 mountains, 11 forests, and 4 copies of the Highland Forest. Just kind of give this a pretty decent, overall mana basis. The deck, I think, performs very well. I do think it's lacking in some categories, whereas you kind of get more of the rare and mythic werewolves into the deck. You kind of gain some more of those synergies. But I do think this is a good starting point if you're looking to possibly play werewolves. Is there also an argument that we maybe have too many ways to kind of fight things and remove things? Probably, but typically in the beginning of any set, when the set drops, the meta is very aggressive. So having ways to kind of slow down your opponent is definitely very good. So I do think it's something you could probably tweak as the meta kind of figures itself out and kind of figures out what's a good deck, what's a bad deck, and kind of tweak the numbers there. But with that being said, let's move on to the next deck and let's talk about it. All right, so the next deck up we have on the list is Selesnya Humans, a deck that is playing around the Coven ability, which is a new ability from Innistrad. That is, if we control creatures of 3 different powers, we get some sort of additional ability. So what we're doing here is we're playing like a aggro-ish version of that deck, playing some of the newer cards for the most part. They're trying to take advantage of that Coven ability. To start it off, we do have Chaplain of the Alms. It's a 1 mana 1/1 with Ward and an ability with Disturb. This is kind of like an interesting 1-drop I kind of want to mess around with. I do actually like it. I think it's pretty decent, and the idea that we have a way to get it back from our graveyard to the battlefield with at its disturb cost and transform it into a 2/1 flying for strikers pretty decent. And then each creature we control has ward 1 on top of it, but then after that, if it would die, it would get exiled instead of going back to the graveyard. So it's the one downfall, but a way to replay a creature. And 1/1 first strike is actually not that bad, but with ward also is pretty decent to kind of have a little bit of protection in the early game, especially if your opponent wants to try to play like some sort of spot removal, especially if their mana is not that great. And we also threw in some guiding voices into the deck. It's kind of one of those things I'm also messing around with because we want creatures of different power and toughness. So giving a +1/+1 counter onto a creature we control, and then also the ability to learn. So this card replaces itself. So if we need our green mana, we can always get something like an sciences from the learn board. It's just kind of one of those things I threw in the deck to kind of give us that benefit to help us set up our Coven the proper way if we're really struggling to get creatures of various different powers. Then we have Contortionist Trope. It's a X cost green. 0/0 enters battlefield with X+1/+1 counters on it in the late game. This becomes a great mana sink because you can put whatever mana you have into it to make it whatever power and toughness. And then has the covenant ability of at the beginning of your end step, if we control 3 or more creatures with different powers, we have to put a +1/+1 counter onto target creature we control. So essentially, it gets to put counters on things. So it's definitely a creature that helps us grow our creatures, and also maybe finds that spot where we may need a creature of a different power that we may not have on the battlefield to then start triggering Coven. Then after that, we have the Ambitious Farmhand. I actually really like this card for a 2 mana 1/1. Enters the battlefield, we get to search our library for a basic plains card. We get to put into our hand. That's pretty awesome. And then for 3 mana, for the Covenant ability, we can transform it into, um, you know, we can transform it into this 3/3 lifelinker, which is definitely pretty awesome just because it is kind of like one of those things in the early game, helps us, get mana from our mana from our deck, and then eventually becomes a 3/3 lifelinker that our opponent may have to deal with. Just because this deck plays a lot of things that are low to the ground and like very small, I thought Kabir Takedown would be a pretty decent spot removal spell. That's the one thing I do think that mono white kind of lacks, is kind of that spot removal. I do think it's interesting in the fact that it's a 2 mana, deals damage equal to the creatures we control, target creature or planeswalker. Worst case scenario, we can always play it as a tap white mana source. But I do think it's a pretty interesting card to have in a deck that plays a lot of creatures. Then we have Ritual Hope. It's a 2 mana instant spell. Creatures we control get +1/+1 until end of turn, so kind of like one of those additional pumps. But if we have the Coven ability, we actually give them +2/+1 until end of turn instead. So it's one of those benefits to us as we kind of develop our board of different powers and toughnesses to get that additional +2/+1. It kind of brings me back to like the Azorius Tempo decks that used to be around, the Flyers, where you swing in, you drop a 2 mana pump spell, and then untap all your creatures, kind of thing. But I mean, it's not as good as that, but it is definitely pretty decent for like an aggro aggressive deck. Then we have Timberland Guide. It's a 2 mana 1/1. Human Scout. When it enters the battlefield, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So a creature just kind of pumps another creature on the battlefield. Doesn't have a Covenant ability, but I do think it's yet again another creature that helps us kind of, spread out the differences in powers and toughnesses, just so we can, get to that Covenant ability sooner. Then we have Join the Dance. It's a 2 mana sorcery spell that puts 2 human creature tokens, then has flashback of 5. So yet again, once we start developing our board, we can actually, get very wide, which is definitely to our benefit. This is definitely very good as well, just in case your opponent plays some sort of board wipe. We have a way to, at least put some things on the battlefield in the later game for 5 mana, or in the early game for 2 mana, which is definitely pretty awesome. Then we have Catilda Dawnheart Prime. It's a 2 mana 1/1. Protection from Werewolves. This is kind of like where we put some of our rares in the deck. And then human creatures we control have tap it, add 1 mana of any color of this creature's colors. So essentially, if our creature is green white, we can produce green white. If the creature is white, we produce white. If it's green, we produce green. And then for 6 mana, we can tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature control. So essentially, just a ability that just pumps all our creatures across the board. Definitely pretty awesome, and also has protection from werewolves, just in case you do get matched up against werewolves or wolves for the most part. They have Dawnheart of the Wardens. It's a 3 mana 3/3 with Vigilance. At the beginning of our combat on our turn, if we control 3 or more creatures with different powers, we get +1/+0 into end of turn. So essentially just making our attack more aggressive, which is definitely very good, especially for our very wide. Getting those additional points of damage is always to our benefit. And then the last card we have is Seergar, Champion of the Lights. The kind of the big card in the deck. It's a 2 copies in this deck, but I do think you probably want to get to 3 copies if you do get more mythic cards to unlock. But it is a 4/4 for 4, fly and trample. Gives all our humans +1/+1, so our deck is full of humans. And then it has the Covenant ability of whenever it attacks, if we control 3 or more creatures with different powers, look at the top 5 cards of our library. We reveal a human creature among them, put it onto our hand, and put the rest on the bottom of our library in any order. So a little bit of tempo in that card. I do think the deck is missing a little bit more of a way to kind of slow down our opponent. I do think the Kabir Takedown's okay, but our goal here with the deck is just to be as aggressive as possible and hit our opponent as quick as possible. Then our mana base is 8 of the plains, 10 of the forest, and 4 of the Arctic tree lines. And yet again, I do think if you have it, these are just base decks to kind of start off with. But if you always have the rares lands, you can always swap them out, so you have rare untap lands. And I did think about creature lands as well. I'm unsure about that just because I know some of them come into play tap in the later game, but they come in to play untap in the first couple turns. So I guess it's kind of figure out your mana base. But I do think playing about 22 lands is not too bad for the deck because our highest creature is only 4 mana, and most of the creatures are 3 or less. So that is, Selesnya Humans. Let's move on to the next deck and let's talk about it. First and foremost, though, before we go over there, I do play a learn board. Just we only have the one learn card, so it's nothing that we're gonna get to a lot. But we have environmental sciences for that little bit of mana in case we need that green mana if we haven't drawn it. We have reduced to memory. This is a way to kind of remove some sort of permanent that may be in our way or annoying us. Containment breach to get rid of those annoying artifacts or enchantments. Expand anatomy just kind of help spread some power around to our creatures and give it vigilance for the turn. And then introduction to prophecy for a little bit of that card draw and scry. And then introduction to annihilation for that exile target permanent, and then your opponent gets a card out of it. But that's kind of like our learn board we're going with. But the overall budget is pretty decent for this one, especially if you're looking to maybe play some sort of human style deck. So this next deck up is a Rakdos Vampires deck. Now, the deck 100% isn't all just vampires for the most part, but it is playing a lot of the new vampires in the deck and playing some of the old ones. I do think now that we have other vampires to kind of go along with it, it actually isn't that bad. The first one is we have Florian, the Volderin Scion, 3/3 legendary creature, vampire noble. It has first strike at the beginning of our pre-combat main phase. Look at top X cards of our library. X is the total amount of life your opponents have lost this turn. Exile up to one of those cards, put the rest on the bottom of our library in any order. You may play the exile card this turn. So essentially has a way to kind of like look at top card, get something that maybe we could play, and then essentially play it, without having to draw it, which is definitely pretty awesome. Other than that, it's playing some of the, some of the tricks that we've had prior, to the release of Innistrad, but it's also playing a lot of the newer cards that kind of synergize pretty well with the deck overall. So first we have is Shambling Gas. I do think it's a pretty decent one drop. The ability to, if it dies, it gets to give target creature -1/-1, or creates a treasure, so a little bit of that mana ramp. We have Volderin Stinger. It's a 1 mana 1/1, and it has first strike as long as it's attacking. And for 3 mana, we can dump into it. We can give it +2/+0 into end of turn, so it becomes a 3/1 vampire warrior. And it has first strike when it attacks in. So overall, pretty decent, one drop as well in the common slot. Then we have Deadly Dispute, because I do think this is kind of like the good card in black to kind of get some additional cards into your hand and also create treasures. You can sacrifice a creature or artifact and then draw 2 cards and create a treasure token, so it kind of replaces a possible treasure we may have sacrificed to get this ability to go off, or getting 2 cards into our hand to get that maybe find that answer we need against our opponent is definitely pretty awesome there. Infernal Grasp is the new removal spell. It's a 2 mana destroy target creature, you lose 2 life. I do think this is probably a little bit more on the aggressive side, but I do think this is going to be one of those removal spells you're going to see a lot of, because in the early turns, two life isn't the worst thing to have. But yet again, we'll see where the removal at 2 drop really lands with what cards become the 2 drop removal. They have Vampire Interloper. It's a 2 mana 2/1. It has flying and it can't block. It's the one downfall, but having flying for 2 mana is not terrible. That's why we only have 2 copies. It's kind of one of those things I didn't want to have 4 copies, just because 4 creatures that we could possibly draw that can't block is not always very good. But in the early turns, if we were trying to be an aggressive, 2/1 flyer is not bad. We have Hungry for More. It's a 2 mana sorcery spell that create a 3/1 black-red vampire creature token with trample, lifelink, and haste. And you sacrifice at the beginning of our next end step. So this is kind of one of those things that we can kind of get in on our opponent and attack aggressively. Maybe we need that 3 points of life. Maybe we want to get in that additional damage. If we draw in the late game, our opponent does have a lot going on. We can play it and then play it again. Get 2 of these guys. Attacking for 6, power, and then gain 6 life, and also possibly do some damage to our opponent's face. I put in Kalen, Reclusive Painter, because I do think it synergizes pretty decently with this deck overall. Enters battlefield to create a treasure token. Other creatures you control enter the battlefield with additional +1/+1 counter on them for each mana from a treasure spent to cast them. We don't have a lot of ways to produce treasure, but in the early turns we do have some treasures that we can produce. So we probably could make some of our early plays, a little bit bigger, make a little bit more threatening against our opponent. Then you have Vampire Socialite. It's a 2 mana 2/2 with Menace. Enters the battlefield if the opponent has lost life this turn. Put a +1/+1 counter on each other vampire you control. And as long as the opponent has lost life this turn, each other vampire you control enters the battlefield with additional +1/+1 counter on it. So it's definitely pretty awesome in what it's trying to do here. In the early game, maybe you're trying to swing in and play this on the second main, which is definitely very beneficial. So you swing in, then play this afterwards, making all your vampires even stronger that may have attacked in. And then in the later game, if we swing in and we've dealt damage to our opponent, then any creature we play in our second main phase will also get an additional +1/+1 counter when it comes into the battlefield. So just making our board that much more threatening. Then in the 3-drop slot, we have Stormkick Blood Thief. It's a 3 mana 2/2. At the beginning of our end step, if an opponent lost life this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target vampire you control. So yet again, another creature here that is going to distribute some +1/+1 counters onto vampires, making that much harder for our opponent to remove them without any sort of direct removal spell. So definitely a pretty cool card. Yet again, we don't need many copies of it just because I do think we have cards in the deck that do it a little bit better. But, you know, it is pretty awesome to have in general. And then we already kind of went over Florian. Just overall pretty decent card that helps us, you know, dig a little bit deeper into our deck. We have Death Priest of the Miracle. It's a 4 mana 2/2. It gives any skeletons, vampires, and zombies we control +1/+1, so making all our vampires that much stronger. And then in case, you know, any of our creatures do die, we can always pay 1. Or if any creatures die, we can pay 1 and create a 1/1 black skeleton creature that actually is a 2/2 because of the +1/+1 effect here. So overall, pretty decent, you know, lord for the deck. I don't think there is a vampire lord currently in, you know, standard, so this is the best we're gonna get for 4 mana. And then in the 6-drop slot, we have the Zagas Thief of the Heartbeats. It's 6 mana 4/4. Costs 1 less for each creature in our party. I think we play a couple cards that could make this a little bit lower, maybe making it cost 5 or 4. I don't know if we have 2 different, you know, we don't have, I'm not sure if we have clerics and, you know, wizards in the deck, but I know we can definitely get it to at least 5. 4 is a possibility, maybe, if I double check the deck. But essentially gives flying, death touch, and haste. Other creatures we control have death touch, making them that much more of a pain to block because whatever our opponent blocks with, they're gonna die in the process. And then whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a planeswalker, destroy that planeswalker. So it doesn't have to do all the damage; just has to do enough damage to that planeswalker. Then the mana base is 24 lands, 11 of the swamps, 9 of the mountains, and 4 of the sulphurous mire. And the last deck up on the list here is we have my Dimir Zombies kind of budget style deck. Some of the cards you may have seen already prior before in Innistrad as a whole. I also went with Snow here in this scenario just because I do think Snow kind of synergizes pretty well with zombies. One of the reasons being Nefari here is kind of like one of the better zombie lords in the format for zombies, as one, it gives other snow and zombie creatures control +1/+1, and has the ability for 3 snow mana. We can return him from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped, so we can kind of get him back even if our opponent does kill him or he dies in combat. Other than that, you know, the zombies deck is pretty interesting on what you can do. It plays some of the same cards that I think that you know, are in mono black that are very good to kind of get some little bit of that card advantage, well as experiment with some of the other cards that have got introduced with Innistrad. But for the most part, we can kind of go over the deck and talk about kind of what it is doing here. We have 2 copies of Bloodchief's Thirst, just in case, you know, you want to get rid of some sort of planeswalker. We can kick it as well to, you know, destroy target planeswalker or creature with mana value 2 or more, or for 1 mana we just destroy target creature. Champion of the Perished is a new card that came from Innistrad, and I think this is kind of where I devoted the rares to the deck, as we do have 4 copies of it. It's kind of one of those things that if our opponent can't deal with it early and it grows big enough, it can actually become a pretty decent threat that we can kind of, you know, stomp our opponent with over time. Like I said, it's a 1 mana 1/1. Enters whenever another zombie enters the battlefield under our control, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Champion of the Parish, and we have various ways that we can actually, you know, get additional zombies out. Not just playing creatures, but we do have some spells in the deck that we can get additional zombies with. Then we have Eaten Alive, which is another card I'm kind of experimenting with. I'm not 100% sure if I'm sold on this one just because, you know, maybe we could take these 2 copies and just give it to Bloodchief's Thirst instead. But it's kind of one of those interesting cards that we can, you know, pay 1 mana, or as additional cost of the spell, we can either sacrifice a creature or pay 4 mana, and then we exile target creature or planeswalker. You know, it's kind of one of those things that you can kind of pick and choose here. It's okay. I do have some mechanics that, you know, we benefit from creatures dying. So, I mean, it's kind of one of those things that if we sacrifice a zombie in the process, we can maybe, you know, get, you know, this as well. Then we have Rotten Reunion. It's a 1 mana 1 mana instant speed with flashback spell that exiles up to 1 target card from a graveyard. We create a 2/2 zombie creature with token with Decayed. Essentially, Decayed is one of this. Whenever this Decayed creature attacks, we have to sacrifice it in the combat. So it's essentially we can just, you know, get very wide very quickly. We can eat things from our opponent's graveyard that we think our opponent can, you know, bring back or flashback in a way, or disturb or whatever they may be trying to do. So I do think for 1 mana it's definitely very good, and even 2 mana flashback is also very good. So I do think we can, you know, crank out 2 zombies in for 3 mana, which is pretty awesome. Then we also went with Shambling Gas because it is a zombie. It's a 1 mana 1/1. yet again, has two different abilities. When it dies, we get to either create a treasure token to ramp up, or we can, target creature gets -1/-1 to end a turn. Dead Dispute, because, it is kind of like the draw mechanic in the deck. We can sacrifice one of our zombie tokens or even our Shambling Gas to get this ability here, create a treasure token, and draw 2 cards. Ghoulish Procession is kind of that enchantment that I was kind of talking about. Whenever one or more non-token creatures die, we get to create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed, and this ability triggers only once each turn. So, if our opponent attacks, we block, we can get a replacement zombie that we can maybe swing in against our opponent on the back end. We can always sacrifice, one of our creatures, get a zombie that way. We have different ways that we can probably do this, and we also have removal spells to, remove our opponent's things that we can also probably trigger this ability as well on their turn, not just our turn. We also kind of went with the Infernal Grasp because I do think it is, one of the better 2-drop removals with the cost of paying 2 life. But overall, pretty decent removal spell at instant speed for 2 mana. Priest of the Haunted Edge is a 2 mana 0/4. It has the ability to tap it, sacrifice it. Target creature gets -X/-X. It's a turn where X is the number of snowlands we control. We only play snow mana, so whatever how many snowlands we have out, it'll have that many, -X/-X on target creature. Then on top of it, it actually creates a pretty decent wall that we can block, some of the early damage. And once we start getting our zombie lords out on the battlefield that pump our zombies, it then can actually deal damage back to those creatures that may be attacking. So it can become a little bit of a protection against our opponent's creatures, especially if they are playing pretty aggressive. Then we get into the first zombie lord here. We have Blade Stitch Scab. It's a 2 mana 2/3, which is actually pretty solid for a 2-drop because 3 toughness is definitely pretty strong. And it gives all our other zombies +1/+0, so it makes our Decayed zombies that much stronger. It makes any of our other zombies have that 1 additional power, which is pretty awesome. And in itself is also zombie soldier, so it actually chains pretty well with something like Champion of the Parish. We play Champion on turn 1. We play this on turn 2. Our Champion's now a 3/2 on turn 2 and swinging in for 3 damage, which is pretty awesome. So definitely pretty good synergy there. Then the 4-drop slot, we are playing 2 Priests of the Mackerel as well. It's a 4 mana. It's a little tough to, that we don't really need it, but it's definitely a benefit to the deck. Just having a way to get additional +1/+1 on our zombies is always very good. And then, having that additional ability of paying 1 mana to just create a little bit of a skeleton army as well, even if our things do end up dying in the process. Having skeletons replace, them over time is definitely pretty awesome as well. And then, like I said, Nefari, Betrayer of the King, is kind of like the zombie lord that helps our zombies just get that much stronger. And on top of it, if it does go to the graveyard, we can always return it as long as it's not exiled, and you only pay 3 snow mana to do so, though it does come into the battlefield tapped. Other than that, the mana base is pretty straightforward. We played 24 lands, 7 of the snow-covered islands, 13 of the snow-covered swamps, and 4 copies of the Ice Tunnel. And this is kind of like my early iteration of a zombie-style deck. We really only splashed the blue mana for the Blade Stitch Scab or the Nefari, which I do think is pretty decent there. I mean, if you don't have some of these new cards, you can always go mono black and try that out. Though you do lose out on something like I said, the Blade Stitch or the Nefari, which are pretty decent for being only uncommons. Other than that, I mean, let me know what you guys think about each of these decks. What decks are you guys playing? What's working for you? I am probably going to be doing a video on decks that really don't have a budget in mind. So I'd probably either be experimenting with more powerful versions of these decks or other decks I'm kind of coming up with, on the channel here. So if you want to, drop a like to let me know you guys like the video. If you guys want to drop a comment, let me know what you guys are looking to see. If you guys are new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. Definitely helps out a lot. And if you're new here, welcome to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.